Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. We are on episode 4 of our Mr. McMahon documentary series. This time we will be discussing Vince McMahon versus the media. Phil Mushnick, Bob Costas, John Stossel, Richard Belzer, and others. This is probably the least interesting element, but also the most revealing when it comes to Vince McMahon himself. In every part of the story, Vince talks about how much he likes to fight and he likes challenges, but he doesn't seem to do very well at them. You know, John Stossel, episode 1, he gets smacked by Dr. D. David Schultz. He shows up at the WWE to do a expose. Now, Hogan, in the documentary, tells the story that John Stossel was supposedly coming in to find out how popular Hulkamania really is. So he's kind of lying to get his foot in the door. But once his foot is in the door, he starts telling the boys, oh, you use a razor blade to cut yourself. You're lying to the audience. This is not wrestling. This is fake. And because, the boys are trying to be protective of the business, they go to Vince, and Vince says, well, somebody needs to do something, according to Tony Atlas. This leads Dr. David Schultz to smack John Stossel. But Stossel is an interesting situation because a few years later, Vince, of course, would go on television and admit that wrestling is just entertainment. So John Stossel got smacked for no reason. Now, they didn't talk about in the documentary why Vince decided to go public with it's just entertainment. They decided not to bring up the deregulation that him and Linda worked on to change pro wrestling in the various states like Philadelphia and New Jersey so that they could, cut taxes and different things like this. And this is very important to the growth of the business. Very important to the growth of the industry. Because to a degree, you don't even get ECW without Vince and Linda getting wrestling deregulated in Pennsylvania. You don't really get Ring of Honor if they don't work with the athletic commissions in New York and New Jersey. So the Northeast area really benefited from Vince and Linda saying that wrestling isn't real and going into these governments and saying we shouldn't be regulated like we are real. We shouldn't be regulated like boxing. And MMA wasn't a thing yet. But we shouldn't be like boxing or karate or anything else. That might be full contact. So John Stossel got smacked for nothing. He got smacked for being disrespectful. Not for trying to expose the business, because Vince would do that himself a little bit later. He got smacked for being disrespectful. And that sets the stage for Vince and Bob Costas. And Bob Costas is the most interesting thing. He's very interesting. Because I did not know that Vince and Bob Costas was on David Letterman together. I knew Vince was on David Letterman. I didn't know Bob Costas was on that same episode. Because I just never sat down and watched it. So these two knew each other from their younger days. And Bob Costas participated in the Rock and Wrestling in the 80s. As Vince is on the rise, Bob Costas comes in and does some ring announcing. Bob Costas in the documentary is talking about how much he liked that product. The Hogan era. He thought it was funny. It was entertaining. It was, right up his alley. It's what he preferred. And then Bob withdraws. Around the time Desert Storm happens, Hulk Hogan is fighting Sergeant Slaughter. They're burning Iraqi flags and they're doing this stuff. And Vince is trying to discuss how sometimes they rip storylines from the headlines, much like Law and Order. Hey, this is what's going on in the world. We're going to do what's going on in the world. And Bob Costa says, look, I was supposed to be involved in WrestleMania 7. I backed out because it was tasteless what they were doing, exploiting the war, which I give him a thumbs up for that. That's not my favorite storyline going in pro wrestling. For starters, I didn't think that it was all that great. in terms of a storyline. And then I don't think the finish was great either. And that's what storylines are all about. It's all about great characters, great finish. If they'd have gone with the original idea, which is Sergeant Slaughter just turns heel and stays like the American hero, and he doesn't like the way the country is going and all this kind of stuff, it might have been fine. But the Iraqi sympathizer element was a big turn off to Bob Costas and a lot of other people. Normal people. It's one of these things that we learned is Vince McMahon is not normal. Right? So Bob's in relationship with Vince is strains around 1990, 1991. And then the XFL happens. And this is where they have their big blow up. Because I wish, me personally, I wish I hated something as much as Bob Costas hated the XFL. And they sit down and they have a conversation about it. And Bob Costas is talking about how the XFL, really bad product, terrible product. It's crude. It's too much WWF, not enough sports. The play and the players are terrible. This is not good. And he confronts Vince with this and about the epic failure of the XFL, and Vince gets defensive. On Vince's side, he talks about how he kind of expected Bob Costas to be tough. But he also expect, that they were friends and there would be some friendliness to it. But Bob Costas is a neutral reporter. He's pretty legit. And Vince, once the pressure came, for all his bluster about loving challenges and liking the fight, he's incredibly sensitive. These criticisms that Bob Costas is putting upon him are true, for starters. The game sucked. The ratings were going down. It was too much WWF in the XFL. All of these things are true. It was a massive bomb and wasted a bunch of people's money. But Vince gets defensive about it. I mean, it's also true that he talked about this in the documentary. He knew nothing about football when he started a football league. He just did it because he could. He wanted to try something else. And when talking to Bob Costas, he says, I'm an entrepreneur. I take risks. This is what it makes America go round. Which is a good response to this thing is going to be an epic failure. Hey, sometimes things fail, bro. And Vince had a lot of failures. And if you talk to Vince detractors, they'll talk about failures all day. But he got so defensive that he escalated the situation. Sitting on the edge of his seat, leaning in. But to Bob Costas' credit, he's cool. He's sitting there, legs crossed, watching Vince perform. He's not getting agitated, not getting concerned, even as Vince is trying to take things to the next level. And even all these years later, Vince is sitting there thinking about how he wanted to kill Bob Costas. And as smarmy as Bob Costas can be, and as somewhat disingenuous as he can be, Vince is huge in comparison. He's the guy with something to lose here. But what you see is that Vince is very impulsive. Right? It can go from 0 to 60 real quick. Especially when he's flummoxed and he's not really sure what to say and there's no handlers there. We see this a lot with Vince. This is the most obvious one. This is the one that people point to when what kind of person is Vince McMahon? Let's watch him go off on meek little Bob Costas, who just criticizes him and criticizes the company, well, the XFL, not even the WWF. And Vince is ready to pounce like a wild tiger on this guy who is like much smaller and much obviously weaker. And he looks like a bully. And in the documentary, he still talks about how he wants to murder Bob Costas. He wanted to strangle him and put his hands around his neck. And this was a guy he thought was a friend. He felt betrayed by Bob, apparently. But this sets the stage, of course. John Stossel gets slapped for being disrespectful. Vince thinks that Bob Costas is getting disrespectful. He's He wants to kill him. So if he wanted to kill Bob Costas for criticizing the XFL, what do you think he wanted to do to Phil Mushnick? Phil Mushnick is still alive and well, and Phil Mushnick is the New York Post reporter who exposed the Ring Boy scandal. Apparently, Tom Cole approached him and told him about the Ring Boy scandal, and he wrote about it, and it became a huge national story, and Vince ended up on Donahue, where he got embarrassed again by that con man, Murray Hodgson. Bruno Sammartino, Superstar Billy Graham, Dave Meltzer, John Arezzi, they're all there to talk about sexual harassment of young boys and steroids, etc. And Vince is in a circular firing squad. It's him versus all of these people. Anytime he tries to tell any story, one of these guys pipes in about how it's not true. The documentary does this a lot, showing, Vince saying something and then they cut to something else not being true. And it's good for dramatic effect. When Bruce is talking about how Vince is a human being, and then it cuts to 2 days later, the Janelle Grant thing happens. Very entertaining stuff. But back to the Phil Mushnick element. Vince and Phil Mushnick apparently never actually met. Mushnick, despite being the guy who wrote the articles about the steroid trial, despite writing about the Ring Boy scandal, he never made any public appearances about it. But he says that Vince McMahon is a dirtbag, and how he got all these letters from sources over the years talking about how terrible Vince is and how much of a terrible person he is. And he was the only one in the mainstream media willing to stand up and talk about how bad the WWF was, how bad wrestling is. And I say, look, he has some legitimate critiques, but it did borderline go into the personal between him and Vince. And I'm pretty sure that if he could have got his hands on Phil Mushnick, he would have. But Phil Mushnick is the one who's writing articles saying that Vince is witness tampering, or he's paying off witnesses in the steroid trial, and all this stuff. Phil Mushnick seems to be pretty much one of the only people who thinks that Vince is guilty. Even to this day, he still thinks Vince was guilty. He discusses in some articles that he contacted Donald Trump and tried to convince Donald Trump not to hire Linda McMahon because Vince was running a death mill and he was running steroids and a pedophile ring. And the fire went both ways. Vince himself would go after Phil Mushnick on television, especially after the steroid trial was over. And then, of course, Jim Cornette went after Phil Mushnick. So the relationship between the two of them, the rivalry, I guess you could say, where Mushnick will say something out of pocket, it would trigger Vince and he would respond to all this. Vince blames the entire steroid trial on Phil Mushnick because he was writing these articles. Vince ultimately blames Phil Mushnick for the entire steroid trial and said that he was an FBI informant, which Mushnick says, yeah, I was an FBI informant. They were reading my articles. It's one of those very interesting Frost-Lincoln kind of relationships where Mushnick is looking for something, anything to bring down Vince. And it finally happened with the hush money scandals. And he's thrilled about it, of course, because now it says that I was right 30 years ago when I said the guy's a dirtbag. He's a scumbag. He should never be anywhere near the White House. Your children shouldn't be watching the WWF. Finally, somebody's going to prove me right. It just took until 2022 to do it. And it wasn't me. It was somebody else. But hey, blessings come in all shapes and sizes. The gem, of course, is the Armin Katayan footage where Vince is taking no responsibility for all of the wrestlers that are passing away before the age of 45. It is a true glimpse into how defensive and impulsive Vince can be. It's an interesting scenario because he's what this guy is looking for is just for Vince to show some humanity. That's really all he's looking for. He's not looking for Vince to say anything in particular. He just wants Vince to show some concern for these guys who are passing away at a very young age. And look, Vince's response is perfectly accurate. These guys were grown men. They were doing drugs. They were taking steroids. They live a hard life. They pass away. Some of them committed suicide. Some of them, there were drug overdoses. Some of them were heart attacks. These things, it's unfortunate. Celebrities die often. Wrestlers seemingly die more than other celebrities. It's an issue. We definitely need to talk about it. It's certainly something we should be discussing. But Vince flies off the handle and slaps the papers out of the guy's hands. And you're like, his impulse control is low. His frustration tolerance is seemingly low. And when he's not in full control, you never know what he might do, what he might say. And for a guy who likes to fight and likes challenges, you would think he would welcome this kind of thing. But he's seemingly not very good at it. Again, like he talked about when it comes to Bob Costas, he says he got baited. Well, he got baited on Donahue by this Murray Hodgkin con artist. He got embarrassed there. This Armin Katayan guy embarrassed him too. Bob Costas embarrassed him. And it's all because Vince doesn't know how to answer for these things that's happening in the wrestling business that may or may not be his fault. And whenever the situation occurs where people are looking for an explanation of why did the show continue when Owen passed away? What do you think about these wrestlers dying young? What's going on with Chris Benoit? What you get from Vince is something that is so detached from everything else because he's protecting the business. And by the business, he means both pro wrestling and his company. He can't say that pro wrestling is the cause of Chris Benoit murdering his family. He can't say that because then he has to accept that it's possible that these guys are destroying themselves in the ring and there could be outside the ring consequences. He can't admit that the lifestyle of being a pro wrestler, the constant travel, working with injuries, can lead to these guys using drugs recreationally, especially painkillers. Because that means he might have to change how he does things in order to prevent that. And he did eventually. But we're talking about in the moment, he didn't change anything. And he wasn't looking to change anything. He doesn't like being criticized. Even though he says that he doesn't mind it. He doesn't reflect on these bad decisions, these poor interviews. He doesn't regret doing them. He doesn't mind people criticizing him or going after him, but he wants the ability to fight back. And I can't believe they skipped over the Stand Up for WWE campaign. What? That's tremendous. They didn't go into that. They didn't go into the parent councils blaming WWF for the death of their children. I can't believe they missed that too. That seemed like prime documentary material right there. There was a little bit of it when they talked about the Attitude Era, and how violent it got and how edgy it got and that parents need to pay close. But Vince had a tense interview during that time too, where he was being confronted with their marketing materials. The marketing materials would say, children, put your parents to bed or something like that. And then he would tell everybody, oh no, we're not for children anymore. This is for the 18 to 34 demographic because there's breasts and blood and chair shots to the head and all these things, which people are right to criticize. But he's not quite sure how to handle it. Even in the documentary itself, there's this beautiful scene where Vince is explaining the Attitude Era, where he's saying it's still family friendly And there were no knives, no guns, no rapes, no death. And each time he says nobody died, there's casket matches and buried alive matches. He said, oh, there were no knives. And then there's choppy your pee-pee where somebody has a sword. There were no guns. And there's clearly Brian Pillman there with a gun. And then he says, it's still family friendly, just for maybe a more adult family. Which is a wonderful Vince McMahon twist. It's the kind of Vince-isms I came to this documentary for. So Vince in everything is defending the company. That's one of the things that is the glue of him butting heads with John Stossel and Bob Costas and Phil Mushnick and Richard Belzer, who gets choked out by Hulk Hogan later on, and well, earlier, before WrestleMania 1, because Richard Belzer was making fun of Hulk Hogan and all that kind of stuff. He got choked out, and Hogan, Vince wasn't happy about it, but at the same time, he didn't get punished. Cost Vince a couple of bucks, but it wasn't no big deal, ultimately. But Vince is all about protecting the business, protecting the company. He does not want what Chris Benoit did to be blamed on the company or to be blamed on the industry. Even when he talks about Owen Hart, he says that, oh, we weren't trying to bury Owen, we were trying to make Owen a star. And then talked about the defective clip, even though it wasn't a defective clip. I wish people would stop saying that. It was the equivalent of using the wrong tool for what you're trying to do. Not to go too far into it, but just because you might be interested in what I mean. Try using a Phillip head screwdriver when you need a flathead screwdriver, and vice versa. That's what happened with the Owen Hart clip situation. They were using a clip that was best used on the ground because it was a quick release clip. It was never meant to be used while you're dangling a guy thousands of feet above the ring. That was not the appropriate usage of it. And it was still sold to them as if it would work. So they still managed to sue the manufacturer and get a lot of money out of this thing, because the manufacturer lied about how it could be used, but it wasn't defective. It was that they purchased the wrong clip, the wrong kind of clip for the kind of stunt they were trying to do. So Vince is protecting the company, always in the mode of protecting the company. And again, this thing was not mentioned in the documentary at all. Probably should have been. The absolutely disgusting Melanie Pillman segment, where he brings Melanie Pillman on expressly so that she could say it's not steroids that killed Brian Pillman. Oh, it wasn't. He's not dead because he took steroids. That was him trying to protect the business. Vince's obsession with the business. Vince has gotten himself into a lot of embarrassing situations as being the guy who's trying to protect his company. His company's reputation matters to him far more than his own. And I'm pretty sure he would be happy, thrilled to a degree, that at the end of this documentary, after they destroy Vince in episode 6, they talk about how great the WWE continues to do. Merchandise and attendance and views, everything's up with Vince gone. He's probably like, phew, the company at least isn't getting buried. It might be me personally, but at least they're not burying the company. For a guy who everybody thinks is a narcissist, this is not quite a narcissist's personality. He never goes after these people for coming after him personally. He goes after these people when they attack his company. They talk about in episode 6, why does Vince bring back people who have sued him? People who leave, people who trash talk him personally. Why does he bring them back? And Vince says, I'm a businessman. I'm willing to swallow my pride to do business. It's good for the fans. And some people are saying, like, is it a control thing? Does he like just having control over people? And maybe there's, some element of that there. I can't say that there's 0% that. But when you look at the entirety of McMahon's confrontations, his public fallouts, he doesn't take it personally when these guys are attacking him. When people say bad things about him, he can forgive that. He can look past that. As he has said numerous times, he doesn't really care what people think about him. And of course, usually when folks say that, you question whether it's true or not. But with Vince, it might literally be true. It might literally be that he doesn't care if you think he's a rapist. He doesn't care if you think he's a terrible boss. He doesn't care if you think he's cold and unsentimental, inhuman almost. He doesn't seem to care much at all. You don't see any emotional reaction to all the negativity that is heaped at Vince McMahon personally. You don't see that it affects him personally. But attacks on the company do. That literally seems to affect him. Because that's his life. And so, yes, the impulsive nature of him attacking people for going after the company, it reminds me of that Erykah Badu quote. I'm an artist and I'm sensitive about my shit. Right? Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later.